While human risk management is something most of us are now trying to promote, what does the risk management part of it all mean? And things like risk tolerance or risk acceptance can all sound kind of the same. So, in today's Cybersecurity Awareness Forum, session number 43, we're going to dive a little bit into some risk management terminology and try to figure out how we use risk management in a human risk context. So welcome, everybody. And if this is your first time, the Cybersecurity Awareness Forum is an open collaboration group for anyone who's passionate about security awareness and human risk management. And it's brought to you by ClickArmor, the first cybersecurity training platform designed to fill the gaps between training delivery and assessment so you can have a more resilient security culture. But I'll tell you a little bit more about ClickArmor later on. I'm Scott Wright, CEO and Chief Engagement Officer at ClickArmor, and I help teams build strong, positive, and inclusive security culture. Before I introduce our panel, I would like everybody to type into the chat where in the world you're coming from. It helps sort of appreciate the international presence we have and also gets people used to typing things in. So it's a little easier to get information out of people as we go. I just want to tease people a little bit. I have a promise of something really interesting that I'm going to announce at the end. So if you can hold on for the whole session, I think you'll get a lot of value out of the session and then something fun and interesting to talk about at the end. I'm Scott Wright, CEO and founder of ClickArmor. I already told you that, but I'm going to now introduce our panelists. We have a very insightful group of panelists, and today I'd like to welcome Roger Tremblay, who is a veteran cybersecurity consultant with over 25 years of experience in risk management. He's worked on many critical infrastructure protection projects for public and private sector clients. And Roger is heavily involved in cloud security and zero trust initiatives, and he's passionate about aligning IT security and risk management strategies for enterprises. So we're going to have a really good perspective from Roger on how human risk sort of factors into enterprise risk management. Thanks for joining us, Roger.
Thank you.
Also, we have Fleetus, who's a seasoned IT and security professional, currently a security operations manager. And beyond his expertise, he finds immense joy in sharing passion for cybersecurity with others and telling dad jokes. We have Thea Mannix, who is a behavioral neuroscientist with over 10 years of experience in studying how the biology of our brains can influence our behavior. And in her role as director of research at Praxis Security Labs, Thea now works on applying her experience to cybersecurity scenarios around the human element. And of course, we have Ryan Healey-Ogden, who's the Director of Cybersecurity Solutions at ClickArmor, and he's a passionate speaker and educator who loves to help people understand and implement great security training programs. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, if I can find my Zoom controls here, and we'll get started on a few of our topics to be discussed. So first of all, letting people know, if you haven't heard before, we record these sessions. We do a lot of things to repurpose the content. We create blog posts, and most of all, we create quarterly reports on security awareness that we publish that have a lot of good insights into them. We just published Q4 of 2023. Actually, no, we just published Q1 of 2024. So I'll have to update this slide, but let me know if you want the latest one. I'll get that posted very shortly. And you can also join our Cybersecurity Awareness Forum website, which is a membership site where it's free to get in and we can collaborate. It's where I post the recordings and all kinds of things here. So as we get started, what I wanted to do is share, some of people have already heard me mention before that my background is in risk management before I started doing security training. And I also wanted to give a little bit of context here. But before I do, I did ask people to type into the chat where they're coming from. I don't want to forget that. So we've got people from Denver, Thornton, North Carolina, Oslo, Montreal, Ottawa, Ramera, Pittsburgh. Wow, lots of amazing people. Oh, Turkey, awesome. Great. So yeah, going back to my mention of risk management. My background is in risk management. It was a long time ago, though. So, and this is where I met Roger, our special guest today. Started doing consulting in risk management with the federal government myself about 2003. And so there were a number of methodologies that I came across. And it was interesting coming into security awareness and talking about risk management. And it may not actually have as much understanding in our area where people are working on a daily basis. So I thought it would be good to sort of highlight that. And so I invited Roger to join us. But I'll just make a few quick comments before we get into our polls and questions so that people can get sort of my perspective on it. Essentially, it's the process of implementing decisions that enable the organization to optimize its level of risk. What that means is, if I want to know where I am going to spend my next security dollar, how do I decide that? And the risk management frameworks are really designed to help us do that in some sort of consistent way. But it can seem like a vague concept if you haven't heard of the frameworks. But it is useful, especially for planning and budgeting, so that you can say, well, beyond this budget, I'm not going to be able to invest in all these things that would lower our risk. So you're never going to be able to get to zero risk. So you have to decide what's going to fit in your budget and which of those things are you going to do. You can use risk management for deciding on remediation. So if something has gone way outside of your acceptable risk, what are you going to do about it? And that's part of the risk management process as well. We need to put threats in context. We can look at a compliance regime and say, okay, we've got all these controls that are required to address every threat we can think of, but we have to understand if those threats are relevant or not. Do we have assets that a particular threat is even going to want to go after? Or have we thought about what kind of threats might attack our assets in a particular way? These are all things that I think the risk management approach can help us, especially on the human side. And Roger's going to help us with that. So just wanted to say risk management itself as a methodology is not the same as a maturity methodology. So if you're trying to figure out how you get to the next level of maturity in your program, it's very much different than actually doing risk management or risk assessments. So we'll probably touch on some of those things. Now, before I invite Roger and others to sort of chime in with their content, Roger has a couple of slides prepared, so that's cool. I'm going to actually launch a poll and get people started so we can see a little bit about what the makeup of our team or our group here is and what you guys think. So first question is, does your organization use a defined risk management methodology for measurement or intervention? So you can say yes, no, or you don't know. So we'll let that poll question run for a while. And then I'm going to ask a question just generally, how do you define risk management in a way that is useful or practical? And at this point, I'm going to actually ask Roger to sort of give his first impression, because we've got a couple of slides here that he can speak to. And welcome, Roger, and have at it.
Thank you, Scott, and hope everyone can hear me okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so again, I want to keep those concepts as simple as possible and as practical as possible. So I like the definition you've shown, essentially as showing risk management as a process, to help making decision, implementing decisions. So we want to point to effective risk assessment and risk treatment first, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other aspect is we want to focus on operational risks, as there are more easy to understand at this point with regards to information security. So that's essentially where we use tools as practitioners. We would use tools to assess those risks and treat the risk we identify. Some methodologies are obviously rooted in ISO standards or complement ISO standards. So we use a risk assessment methodology like FAIR, or here in Canada, we have a threat and risk assessment or harmonized threat and risk assessment methodology to complement the risk management process. So that's in a nutshell what the context here.
Do you want to speak to human risk and how it sort of relates to the enterprise?
Well, so again, in the tools that we use to identify risks, we want to focus on essentially how do we measure well, first of all, what scenarios, what risk scenarios do we want to assess in terms of that can be quantifiable or qualifiable. And here, in this case here, we can use a more of a qualitative approach. And we talk in terms of risk, we talk to probability and impact, essentially. When it comes to information security, what you need is to have a methodology that will look at obviously the impact being the loss, and also the threat essentially to the information and the vulnerability of systems or process that safeguards this information. Now, in the case of loss, we use a taxonomy, that essentially will define some scenarios. And some of these scenarios are, related to people, will be scenarios where they're caused by the action taken or not taken by the individual. So we call them inadvertent, threat scenarios. Or you have deliberate actions taken or intentionally or with an intent to harm. And so those scenarios are the ones and finally, sorry, there's what we call inaction scenarios. Of course, I use these based on sources. For example, this taxonomy uses a cert from the Software Engineering Institute. I can provide these sources as if people want to have a closer look. So based on these scenarios, we look at we do an evaluation of the risk based on the loss event frequency, essentially how likely the event is to occur, and how vulnerable are we to those kinds of events. So this will dictate the event frequency, and then the loss magnitude will essentially provide an understanding of the consequence of that event occurring. So we're trying to keep this very simple as much as possible, and we look at these scenarios and say, okay, what are the threat event frequencies for each of these scenarios? And we somehow, we can say that, for example, that inadvertent scenarios may occur, fairly, often, where deliberate scenarios will occur less often. As far as vulnerability, it's possible that you may be more vulnerable to deliberate scenarios because you may not expect your human resources or those human risks to occur. Now, for loss magnitude, the deliberate scenario may have higher loss magnitude. Now, once all of these factors are evaluated, you come to a risk level, and that risk level is important to assess, because if you're going to treat risk, you want to prioritize these risks first, and then you want to figure out how to treat these risks. And that's so if there's essentially, if I know this looks probably complex, and people probably have many questions on what this type of table, how to use these types of table, but these are fairly effective tools from the practitioner point of view. Any question or comments?
Yeah, I'll open it up to the other panelists and you guys can jump in.
I have my hand.
Yeah, there you go.
So I'm wondering, does loss magnitude or risk level include threat event frequency or vulnerability in the calculation? Like, are these interdependent variables,
So
or do
that's a very
you?
good question. So essentially, once you have a value for each, you would essentially factor the three into you know depending on you could use a value, or you could use a calculation in terms of numbers or percentage. But if you have, for example, a moderate loss event frequency and a moderate loss magnitude, well, your risk level could be seen as moderate. I didn't want to put in the risk level here. It's essentially depending on each organization and each context, the risk level would be different based on, again, the likelihood of occurrence and the consequence. So the table is meant as a tool for people to fill in as they see fit, right?
Mm-hmm. Fleetus?
From your experience with this one, let me lower my hand while I'm talking. Similar to like your qualitative and quantitative results, do you risk rank and then drop the high and low when you're using this analysis? Do you have multiple SMEs weigh in so that you're not
Yeah.
skewed, you're high or low on personal preference?
So another very good question. So this part comes from in the risk treatment part, or this part of the process. In the risk level, most practitioner would try to identify scenarios that are, I'd say of material interest here, in that we want to focus on risks that are, possible and that have actual, material consequence. However, if they're in most cases risks that are low, what they call like a low level of risk or very low level of risk, would normally be discarded. In these scenarios that I present, it's very difficult to discard any of these scenarios as being very low or low, because you're talking about a lot of a lot of scenarios that are difficult to I would say to gauge properly based on human behavior, essentially.
Yeah, Fleetus?
Yeah, the reason I bring that up is because of from my putting on my day-to-day hat, the ops side, I can implement least privilege or just-in-time access to keep the frequency or the loss magnitude being contained by what the user has the inadvertent ability to do, either programmatically if they get compromised or by themselves clicking around. So that's why I was curious to
Yeah.
see.
And again, we'll see in the risk treatment scenarios where if, for example, an organization has no appetite for a specific type of risks, they would tend to implement controls that are highly effective and have also at a very strict, standard level, if you will. So in the if you want, Scott, we can move on to.
Yeah, well, actually, I was just going to add a little comment on
Yeah.
Fleetus's question there too. And from my experience, I think you may have said it already, Roger, but I think it's important to highlight. You actually want to try and get as much objective data as possible on things like the threat. So if you can have data about threat frequencies, whether it's internal or maybe it's from an authority like a government authority, or it might be a threat exchange or a provider, something like that. Any data you can find about the kind of threat that you're looking at helps you become more confident rather than just taking, some IT guy's word for, this is a really important high frequency threat, right? So that's all I wanted to say was just sort of make use of whatever data you can and
For
try
sure.
and extrapolate or interpolate if you can too.
Yes, for sure. And keep in mind, if you don't have any data and it's quite possible, and I've seen this as a in my practice, having an opinion from experts, like from anywhere like 4 or 5 experts, can be effective to a certain level. I mean, it could be as effective as a 80% solution if you ask, practitioners, from practitioners' experience. They need to be, have a level of expertise, though.
Yeah, especially if you don't have any significant data that you can extrapolate or
For sure.
make use of. Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
as we opened up, that's why I was going with that. It's like that's why you need to know your business. So if your SMEs know what's going to cause a brand loss, an operational loss, et cetera, it allows you to, Roger's point, to get to the appropriate risk level if you
Mhm.
don't have external data, or you can't map it back to a CVS or CVE or whatever criticality that's known industry-wide.
Yeah. Great. What I'm going to do now is I've launched the second poll question, which is, which of these do you feel best describes human risk? Now, we're asking it a little bit after we've had some description, so hopefully it won't be too skewed, but let us know what your thoughts are, if you're convinced or if you have other sort of views on what human risk actually is. Love to see your response on that. And then I'm going to move to another question that I think we're very close to doing in a follow-up question to Roger anyway. It follows really nicely. Now that we've understood sort of what the risk framework looks like and how we apply it, you have to sort of step back and say, okay, well, how much risk is acceptable? And what are the definitions around acceptable risk? So maybe, Roger, if I'll let you start again, and you can speak a little bit. I actually misunderstood a little bit about this when I set up this session, because risk tolerance may mean something different than what I thought, which was risk acceptance. What is the acceptable level of risk that people are?
So again, we're talking about, and this is a great topic where it's also a bit of an emerging subject. If people are a little puzzled by this is normal. I've read quite a bit of sources on risk acceptance, risk appetite and risk tolerance. It can become very complex if you don't have good examples. I know, for example, that ISACA has have been providing good sources of information on these topics. For risk treatment, and again, we're talking about risk management. We've done a risk assessment. We understand the risk level we're dealing with, and now we want to treat these risks, right? So in the case of risk treatment, to put it simply, we may need to implement more controls. But how do you know if you want? How do you decide on saying, okay, well, we have risks level that are unacceptable, as a whole. If you use a methodology and you say, by the way, all high risks are unacceptable. Well, you might want to have some more granularity. You might want to say, well, some risks are more unacceptable than others. And this is where you want to have, within your organization, you want to determine what is your risk appetite for certain risks. And once you understand your risk appetite, then you can apply risk tolerance, to a certain degree. So if you, I think you've
Yeah,
started.
I just noticed an error I made in the slides, so I'm just going to bring it back up. So there we go. Let me see here.
It's probably my error.
No, it was when I was after the last question I asked you offline. I just wanted to make sure I got it right.
So when you go back to, so let's say if an organization has the following situation when dealing with risk treatment decisions, right? So going back to those scenarios we were looking at earlier, if an organization has no appetite for loss events caused by deliberate or intentional actions with intent to harm, I mean, they do not accept moderate risk level, for example, and they have a standard that requires that all users pass reliability check prior of commencement, starting their job. Then they would say, well, we have no appetite for this, so we will make no exceptions. And so there will be no exception tolerated with regards to this standard or this policy. So that's how you use tolerance. That's how you use appetite and tolerance. So we have no appetite for risk here, and so therefore the level of tolerance will be minimal or non-existent. In another example, you may have a low appetite for a loss event caused by some other scenarios, such as inactions due to lack of appropriate skills, lack of knowledge, and these are scenarios or situations we see often. And however, we would not accept a high level of risk or high risk level in this context. We have a low appetite, so we don't want high level of risk. Now we look at our standards, and our standard says we want all users to successfully complete all job-specific training within a month of commencement. And since you have a low appetite, then you probably have more tolerance here. So you say in your tolerance statement, you could say a 1 week delays are tolerated here in this case here. So you're treating your high risk level with a certain tolerance, essentially. Another example is your standard may say, well, we want all users to be assigned a mentor within a week of commencement. And in this case here, you may not want to tolerate any exception because it still is a high risk. So it's really as a risk management management specialist, you're making recommendations based on these appetite level and tolerance level. There's also sometimes you may have a high appetite for loss. In the case here for loss event caused by human errors, an example of that is you may want all users except your standard may say that you want all users to successfully complete security and awareness training within 2 months of commencement, which reflects a high appetite for risk here. But then you say, well, since I'm giving 2 months, so I wouldn't want more than 1 week delays. So these are 1 week delays will be tolerated. So appetite and tolerance are tools that you use to maneuver the dynamic aspect of risk assessment and risk management. And again, they're emerging concepts. Not all organizations would understand what their appetite is for specific scenarios, but they would certainly be able to, if guided properly, let's say, they would certainly be able to apply these concepts.
Excellent. So do any of the panelists have any questions on risk appetite, risk tolerance? Any examples that you've seen or questions around how certain tolerances might be applied?
I mean, I have an analogy. We can do it later on if we want, but I use it like you're planning to go on a trip and you have 2 options. You can take the highway, which is your low risk, it's boring, it's straight, you know what you're doing, versus the scenic route that can be windy, can be more of an adventure. You have to determine, do you want the balanced, where you take highway for a little while, or you take the scenic route for a while, or you just pick one or the other. So you can be low risk appetite, so you're going to stick with the highway, or you use a very risk appetite where you're taking a windy road, taking the scenic, you're adventurous, you may go through that. So use the analogies of taking a trip. One is the interstate, one is a windy country back road, and it shows your risk appetite of how much risk you're willing to take. Because on the interstate, you're likely set and forget. You put your cruise control, you just drive, it's kind of boring, but you know you're going to get there. The windy road, you don't know. A rock can fall down, a deer could step out in front of you, you could miss the curve. Like there's risk appetites with taking that opportunity. So I use that analogy when I'm talking with people of highway versus a scenic windy road.
Yeah, I was actually going to give another sort of analogy, but it actually comes from real discussions and some of the early learning that I had about risk management when I was working in the government area. When they're talking about military, for example, you say, what's the risk tolerance for a military? You would think, well, it's low because there's a lot of dangerous things. But if you're actually going into a theater, like in a battleground, you cannot get to a low risk, right? You have to accept a higher level of risk in some cases. So it's just an example of why you might want to actually accept higher than low risk. Thea.
Yeah. I just have a question, I suppose, for both of you, Roger and Scott, which is like, have you seen particular industry trends for risk tolerance? So if you're going into a specific industry, would you expect, like, for example, the military, or if you're going into maritime or you're going into tech, are there like patterns of risk tolerance and also, you know, kind of across industry types, for example? And is that correlated with financial gain? So how much money they tend to
Yeah.
have to protect, I
I
guess.
think Felitas had a very good example earlier about user access and the fact that most organizations, for example, in financial industries these days, have very low appetite and very low tolerance for any unauthorized access. And so they would essentially look for like a zero trust, principle, and that they would only give, specific, the required access within the time frame and the for to an individual for the task that individual needs to perform. Like, so only the permission that are required, and only within the time frame it's required. So you're seeing less and less appetite and less tolerance in industries that are highly targeted by threat agents, essentially.
Yeah, and another way I've seen it look, if I'm doing a threat risk assessment in a business like a government agency, right, where it's mostly administrative, they have no reason to accept a higher level risk. It's not that everything is so sensitive. It's just why accept a higher level when we don't have to. All right. I'm now going to start another poll question, and we'll get that going here. So, question is, do you believe that compliance programs are the best way to manage risks in an effective and economical way? This may be a bit of a trick question. I will not editorialize on it more. It may not actually be asked in a very, very good way. I'm glad Kai isn't here today. So I'm going to let people go on that. We'll comment. We'll have the panelists comment on the poll results when we come back at the end. But next question is, how can risk management methodology be used in the context of human risk management? So beyond some of the access controls and other things that we've talked about and other analogies, let's dive deeper into things like phishing, like social engineering. Are there areas where we can see, Roger, that we could easily apply basic risk management concepts in a human risk management regime?
Well, this is essentially the scenarios that I was using, the threat scenarios that I was using,
right?
The taxonomy, essentially try to leverage specific what I call people risks,
right?
And so human risks.
There we are.
And so I believe that those are, as a practitioner, I've always struggled to understand how to assess these risks. Now, these scenarios may help, obviously. And we talked about the fact that we have, little data. And I would say this is one challenge of using risk management and risk, assessment methodology, is the lack of data on these things. And so I would essentially try to, if as a practitioner, I would try to find, better sources of data for these human risk related scenarios. Again, maybe the risk appetite and the risk tolerance can help, kind of fine tune your policy or fine tune your controls based on your understanding of the level of risk. But again, it's a bit of a guessing game as far as I know, and that would be my challenge as a practitioner.
Interesting. I'd like to actually add something here because it's right up sort of the area that we're working in at ClickArmor, especially. I've talked before in sessions about, the gap that exists between when we put people through training. We can measure how many people complete training. That doesn't really tell us how much they actually learned or how resilient they actually are, or how vulnerable ultimately they are. And so the next logical step that most people take is, well, let's test them with live phishing tests, and we'll send them fake emails and see how many they click on. So there's an objective metric to some extent. It's, it's data you can collect on individuals. My concern a lot of times is that these tests are not always designed well, and they're sometimes abused, and they don't take into account some of the externalities in the costs of running those kinds of tests and the unexpected results you're going to get from them. And so I was going to ask Roger what you think of having some intermediate metric where you can say, can we do a better job of testing what people know when we've actually trained them? And so we use what we call immersive phishing simulations. We put them in a virtual mailbox, and they can sort things there, knowing that it's not real, which takes it a little bit away from it being a real risk decision. But on the other hand, it's a better indicator, in my view, than just putting people, counting how many people completed the training. And it may be in some ways better than, and I believe it is a better way to prepare people for doing live phishing simulations and putting them out in the real world. What do you think of that, Roger?
Yeah, I would have two points here. So risk management is more of a journey, essentially. You want to monitor, you want to assess and monitor on a continuous basis, on a continual basis, and try to make some progress over time, and obviously assess these progress. I was talking about zero trust. There's no point putting all these sophisticated controls in place if you cannot assess their effectiveness. So assessing the effectiveness is one aspect. The other point is, I've been in this field for almost 30 years now, as much of an expert as you can find. And I still fail tests sometimes. Every time I come to a new customer or a new client, they put me through their test, and I tend to not score very high.
So does that mean you need more risk management training? Is that what it means?
No, I mean, this is not easy. So because it's not easy, you need to test more and test more effectively. And if it was easy, then you wouldn't need people like me, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a whole row of people waiting to ask questions.
Sorry. Yeah, no, and it's like Roger said, like we, even people that are working this industry for years often say, I fail tests, and that's why we need to manage the risk, because it is real, and there is a risk, and everyone's vulnerable. I would say also the biggest problem with risk management methods and applying them in a workplace is that, as we've been saying, it's very context dependent. So what metrics are meaningful to one organization might not make sense in another organization. And I think the only people that really know what makes sense are the ones that are in charge of security in that place and have an understanding of the organizational culture that will work here, that won't work here because, etc. So I do think it is very context dependent. I don't think anything can be dismissed. But I think we should have quite an open discussion about what's available for people in terms of human risk management, and let them decide, okay, that would be useful for me going forward. Because as well, it has to be something that you can measure and measure again. As Roger said, you need to track changes, you need to measure, have some sort of metric of improvement. Otherwise it's, sort of, blowing dust in the wind, as they say. Yeah, that would be, yeah.
All right, Fleetus.
Yeah, to go along with that, I mean, we've talked on other sessions, and I think we've all come to the realization that like gamification helps, but just doing discussions live fire, so either having tabletops around this, allowing them to experience in a controlled environment and in a no blame situation how our RMF, our risk management frameworks, which one we've chose, is applied. How would we handle this? What controls do we have in place? Because you're sharing at this point, we would have visualization. At this point, we would have an alert. At this point, we would have notification. And you're giving them a readout of how the internal workings of your governance and risk organization looks like, how your security operations works. And they know this is the tools, process, and procedures, all three, that are in place to protect me as the end user, as the employee of this company. So when I do fail, there is a control behind this, and this is why we have these frameworks in place. So doing tabletops, doing birds of a feather roundtable discussions, and just let the user ask questions and share how they would correspond, because we've all seen when you write policies and procedures, if you don't consult with them, they're going to take the shortcut. They're not going to go across the paved brick road that you've laid before them if you don't encourage them and engage them during that implementation of your framework or policy or procedure.
Yeah, I think it goes back to just making sure people understand what they're involved in and what and if our organization believes this is a risk, that's one thing. But now we need to ensure that people understand why this is a risk to the organization. Otherwise, they're not going to make that connection, and they're not going to Fleeta's point, they're not going to participate. And so that's where, I'll plug our own solution, but immersive training does give you that opportunity, because it puts people in situations of risk, and it helps, guide them through it and show them why it's a risk and why we think as an organization this is a risk, and how to make critical decisions against that risk. That's our dream, that everyone doesn't have an emotional response when there's a risk. It's a critical decision-making, process from here on out. So, again, we've always talked about it here because we're very human-centric, but yeah, talking to your people about how they define risk, how they feel about risk, and understanding that, because that'll judge their reactions and how successful you can be.
Yeah, Fleetus?
Just one more quick thing. We keep throwing the word risk around. We might want to educate a user what a risk is versus what a threat and a vulnerability is, because we know the formula as the industry we work in. But if not, they're going to throw the word risk around when it's really just a vulnerability. Or it's like we have to be able to teach them the terms that we're using and why we use threat, why we use vulnerability, why we use probability, like understanding what those mean, because we use them interchangeably some days and we shouldn't. And the end user can get confused by that.
Really good point. Actually, that reminds me, Fleetus, I wanted to show people the poll that I launched earlier in the week around risk, and it was basically just asking, which of these do you consider to be a cybersecurity risk? Was it a phishing email, a $1 million lost to a business email compromise scam, a database with PII in it, or an untrained employee? Interestingly, we got 50 votes, and 2/3 of them said an untrained employee was a risk. Whereas if you've followed the discussion today, you could probably guess that you need to have a lot more context around the situation. What is the actual loss that's expected, and what is the method that the threat is using, for example. And so that's really, I was looking for item B to be what people identified most as a risk. I don't know if that was a fair poll to ask or not, but it was interesting to see the perspective that people have on that. Any comments on that, Roger?
Well, I find this very interesting in that you look for all these are scenarios. Obviously they're all threat scenarios, and so that are more likely to happen if you have untrained employees. Let's put it this way.
The way I actually designed it was to say, okay, where's a threat? What I would call a threat event is a phishing email. It's actually something that's coming at you. Whereas a database with PII, that represents a value of something, but there's no description of what the threat is that might be acting on it. And the untrained employee is really a vulnerability, but we don't know what threat is acting on it or what it's protecting. So that was the context of my question. As I said, it might not have been a fair question, but it was interesting to see people's responses on it. I'm going to go to our poll results now and just spend a few minutes getting people's comments on that. Question 1 was, does your organization use a defined risk management methodology for measurement and intervention? So about 38% said yes, 25% said no, and another 38% said they don't know. That's fair. I mean, I'm sure most people coming into this may not have thought to ask or find out. Question 2 was, which of these do you believe best describes human risk. So I think, 50% of them said it's a definable way of describing expected outcomes that can be measured or assessed in some objective way. I think that fits pretty closely to what we described today. And a few other people had different perspectives on what human risk actually is. And then finally, do you believe that compliance programs are the best way to manage risks in an effective and economical way? So nobody said yes. A few people said no, and most people took my option of it's probably good to have a mix. And that's the way I've always looked at this particular question is, I think compliance provides sort of a baseline or a very low level to meet certain levels of risk management. And then typically you'd want to do some additional risk management on top of that to account for things that the compliance framework doesn't actually do. Does anybody have comments on this or any of the other questions?
I think it's really interesting that people respond so readily to these polls now because it assumes that there is a common understanding of what human risk means compared with security awareness, which is also a discussion that people are currently having. So I'm very interested in what is the standard understanding right now in the industry of what human risk actually means.
Yeah.
And what are they talking about? I think that's very interesting. Are they talking about the threats? Are they talking about vulnerabilities? Or are they talking about risk as an overarching feature? I think it's a very interesting discussion. I don't have any answers, unfortunately.
And it may depend on when I launch this poll question, because before Roger spoke, maybe more people would have chosen number one.
Yeah, that would have been interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Anyway, that's all good. So that's our poll results. So thanks very much, everybody, for participating in that. Now I'm just going to do a few last minute things. I told you guys I was going to share some information, but before we do, let's start by just doing a quick wrap up. I like to just sort of ask people if there are any stories or mentions today that, were insightful. I like to look at it from the point of view of executive level insights. What are the things that would help a CISO or someone understand or better manage their programs? And then at the implementer level, what are some of the actionable things that, security awareness training program or HRM managers might find, or even just for us individually, maybe it's how we choose our destination trip routes like Fleetus wanted us to consider, but things like that. If anybody has any comments on what insights you found valuable, please put them in the chat. And while you're doing that, I just want to point out, I think we got some really good value. Thanks so much, Roger, for helping us in there, and to the others for the questions and other insights as well. But now I'd just like to ask if you could indulge me for a minute while I talk a bit about ClickArmor. And you've heard me talk before about, the benefits of us doing immersive lessons and exercises and things like that. But what I wanted to do was just go back and say, what was the reason we created ClickArmor in the first place? And it turns out that it was because I saw a gap. And we talked about it earlier on in this session, and that was the gap between the delivery of training and the choice of assessment tool and the time that we actually do assessment. And there are a lot of assumptions about, what people are learning, what they're remembering, and whether or not they're actually ready to face those threats in the real world. So in my view, I just sort of put this into a cute little AI generated image to say, if you're not using the right tools when you're building your human risk management program, you probably won't get the culture that you want, because you might be getting a lot of side effects or inaccurate data if you're testing people too early. If you are putting together a vase like this, you might prefer to choose glue over nails, hammer and nails, which could be wise. But on the other hand, you have to also think that if you're gluing something like this together, you actually have to give it a chance to set and harden. And so if we're starting to use it before it's ready, then it's actually not going to work too well either. So some analogies that I like to bring out just to explain the reasoning why we do things the way we do at ClickArmor. So would love to have you reach out to us to learn more. But I mentioned I was going to have something interesting to describe. In this session, I'm going to announce that ClickArmor is now partnering with Conceal, which you may not have heard of. They're at conceal.io. They're a really interesting tech company that fits really well with what we're doing, because we talked about getting metrics around actions and what people are doing. What Conceal actually does, it's an AI-based zero trust browser plugin, and it's able to manage all of an employee base in terms of blocking people from going to banned sites, but also being able to use AI to score websites based on their riskiness. And it will work really well. We've actually used it as a team, and it's instantaneous, and it sort of blocks out those gray area sites that we've seen where, you know, an attacker will create a new domain, they'll launch phishing attacks, and then they'll stop using that domain within a few days. And in that period of time, that site has never been able to get on a block list. And so you may have a subscription to threat, you know, data that tells you you're going to block all these dangerous sites, but there are so many very short-term sites that they're not all that effective. But Conceal, we found, works really well. So we're actually offering a package deal with both our small business package and our medium business package. And just to sort of illustrate this, I'm going to live dangerously and go to my browser. Let me see, where is this? Chrome. Let me see if I can. Hopefully, I'm not sharing my whole screen again. I'm going to turn off my bookmarks bar so that Fleetus doesn't hack me. But let me just first of all show you this. This was ClickArmor. I think I've shown you guys this before. This is our immersive phishing simulations. So basically, you get feedback immediately on choosing things, and that's how we help educate and strengthen, you know, the security awareness of individual employees. But if you were to look at, you know, dangerous sites, this is something I learned from the guys at Conceal. There's this site called openfish.com, and all these URLs are recently documented to be dangerous or risky. And so we can take any of these URLs and go into them, and I'm little hesitant to try ones that I haven't tried before. But if I was to, for example, go to a URL like this, bang, all of a sudden it blocks me. Conceal's blocked me. It's given me a risk score, and it lets me actually say, okay, I want to open that website in isolation. And what that means is it's going to try to actually launch the site, but in a virtual machine somewhere else, not a machine, my machine. So it's actually not going to infect my machine if there's ransomware or anything like that. So that's why we think that the Conceal product is really very complementary to what we're doing at ClickArmor. So all that to say, would love to talk to people if they see a use for having both ClickArmor and Conceal together. We've got a really special package deal for 25 users, $699, or 150 users for $22.49, regularly $6,000. So that's a huge, huge savings. Love to talk to people about how we can help you guys do that. All right, we're near the end. I'm just going to thank everybody, first of all, for joining us. All of the amazing insights from Roger and questions from the panel and the audience. We are actually going to continue in a couple of weeks. The next session, I'm going to be talking with Chris Ellis, who is with Circadence, and they do a really interesting set of training for IT teams. And so there are a lot of things that you can do gamified and simulated for training IT teams. We're going to talk about, we've mentioned it before in some of our sessions, the importance of training the IT teams and the security teams, and the general awareness training. People may not feel all that comfortable saying, hey, you got to take some security training to the IT team or the security training team. So we're going to explore that with Chris. He does a lot of instructions with IT teams. So look forward to seeing you folks on the 29th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And again, thanks everybody for joining us. Take care. We'll talk to you later.